Είμαστε. Ξεκινάς.
Okay. Καλησπέρα, Ανδρέα.
Καλησπέρα.
We're glad to have you. I don't know if you...
Ας κάνουμε το καλωσόρισμα στα ελληνικά, and then Andrea can switch to English, I think. Andrea, hi, I'm Stavros. I'm the founder of the Cube. Welcome. Really glad to have you today. And we've got about 30 or so Bitcoiners gathered. This is the second meetup we're running. We had one a couple of weeks ago when we launched the Bitcoin ATMs, and it was a lot of fun. And it's been a fun couple of weeks where we've had various tests and characters and all sorts of things happening in the Cube with these ATMs. But today we've got, like I said, about 30 people here from a number of Greek startups, but also other people that are interested in Bitcoin in general. And we're keen to, learn more from you and from each other as we progress, through this journey that we're on.
Great. Would you mind moving the laptop just like 10 degrees to your left so that I can capture the rest of the room? There we go.
Here's what I'll do. I'll lift the camera and give you a...
Oh, even better.
Yeah, but that won't stay there, but I'll just give you an idea. Okay. So we're stuck in a basement of the Cube because there's an event happening on the ground floor right now. So we've taken it underground just for today.
Oh, that's okay. I'm a computer scientist. They always put us in the basement.
Alrighty, let's get started then. Thank you very much for being here.
All right. Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Χάρηκα πάρα πολύ που έχω την ευκαιρία να σας μιλήσω σήμερα. Όπως καταλαβαίνετε, είμαι Έλληνας. Μεγάλωσα στην Αθήνα. Πήγα στο Λύκειο στην Αθήνα. Αλλά έφυγα στα 17 και πριν από 27 χρόνια. Έχει περάσει πολύς καιρός και οι γονείς μου είναι ακόμα στην Ελλάδα και επισκέπτομαι όσο πιο συχνά μπορώ, κάθε 2 χρόνια τουλάχιστον, πιο συχνά από ό,τι μπορώ και πολύ λιγότερο πιο συχνά από ό,τι θα ήθελε η μητέρα μου, όπως καταλαβαίνετε. Αλλά θα σας ζητήσω συγγνώμη και θα συνεχίσω την υπόλοιπη ομιλία μου στα αγγλικά. Και ο λόγος είναι ότι παρόλο που μιλάω ελληνικά και καταλαβαίνω άπτεστα ελληνικά, δυστυχώς το θέμα του Bitcoin έχει πολλές λέξεις τις οποίες τις ξέρω μόνο στα αγγλικά και θα δυσκολευτώ πάρα πολύ να κάνω την παρουσίαση στα ελληνικά και επομένως θα σας ζητήσω συγγνώμη και θα γυρίσουμε στα αγγλικά από εδώ και πέρα. So thank you very much for being patient with me as I do this presentation in English. If you have any difficulty understanding, please let me know. I will be happy to repeat or translate, or Stavros can, I'm sure. And I'm quite happy to take your questions in Greek or English or whatever you want. My name is Andreas Antonopoulos. I've been involved in Bitcoin now for almost 4 years. I first discovered Bitcoin in the beginning of 2012 and became fascinated with this technology and started working on it on a full-time basis. Last year, I published my first book on the topic called Mastering Bitcoin, which is a book that is for developers, primarily software engineers, and it is a technical explanation. The most common question I'm asked to answer is, what is Bitcoin and how does it work? And today, that answer is not simple. And so I have a 300-page answer to that question, which is my book. And if you want, you can buy it, but you can also download it for free. It's available online under an open source Creative Commons license, and that means that anyone can download it, read it, or even translate it. I would also like to point out that while my book has already been translated into Hungarian, Japanese, German, and is in the process of being translated into Spanish, Italian, and Mandarin Chinese, the Greek translation has not been progressing very fast. So all of those present who speak both English and Greek and would like to help with the cause of Bitcoin, I invite you to join the open source translation effort, which is taking place on a website called Transifex.
We know Transifex. We know Transifex.
Very good. So my book is available. You can translate it into Greek, and once it's translated into Greek, it can be sold by you or by a publisher without any need for licensing, or it can be made available for free to everyone. And so if you are interested in helping promote the cause of Bitcoin in Greece, I think a technical book in Greek that explains how Bitcoin works would be a useful addition. So enough about me. I'm here to talk to you about Bitcoin. So first of all, let me ask the audience, how many people in this room own some Bitcoin or have made Bitcoin transactions? Hands up.
That's
all
about
right. And how many people?
80%.
That's 80%. And how many people in this room are completely new to Bitcoin until this presentation?
0%.
No one. Fantastic. Great. So we can get started. So what is Bitcoin? I think for a lot of people and a lot of the media coverage, Bitcoin is a digital currency. It is a form of money that exists on the internet, and it is a form of money that can live in parallel to the euro, or even potentially replace the euro as the currency that people use on a day-to-day basis. I don't think that's true. In fact, I think that Bitcoin is fundamentally different from that depiction. Yes, Bitcoin is a currency, but currency is an application of this technology and is only a very limited component of what Bitcoin is. If I was trying to describe the internet to you in 1990, I could use email as a description and tell you that the internet was a form of sending messages online. And that would capture some of the concepts. And if I described the internet as email, you would understand what it can do. But that's not what the internet is. The internet is not email. The internet is much more than email. And that's not what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is a currency, but it is much more than currency. Bitcoin is a network, and it is a platform for applications, and it is an open protocol that allows applications to be built on this platform. If you have a platform that allows you to record the ownership of property, digital property, online, then the first application you build with that platform is a currency. But currency is just the first app. Currency is just the first app on the internet of money. And I think it is much more useful to think of Bitcoin as the internet of money, a network that has applications, and these applications are of a financial nature, so currency, stock, bonds, real estate transactions, but also of non-financial in nature. The Bitcoin platform allows us to record information in a way that makes that information exist for a very long time and can prove when that information existed. So it can be used as a registration database that can register ownership of assets. For example, it can be used, yes? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. It can be used to register the ownership of land or buildings or bicycles or cars. It can be used to create other currencies other than Bitcoin. It can be used to build applications for stock trading, for running companies, for controlling shares, for international trade, for import and export, and of course, for basic e-commerce payments. So I think it is important to understand that Bitcoin is not just currency. Bitcoin is a new internet on top of the existing internet that allows us to convert money into information, money into media, and allows us to record ownership and information in a trusted way across the globe. And to do all of these things without any central point of failure, without any central authority, without any government, without any banks. Over the last month or so, I have been asked to participate in many interviews and to offer comments to international media organizations as to the effect that Bitcoin has on Greece during the financial crisis in Greece. And the reason I've been asked is simply because I am someone who is recognized in Bitcoin, and my name is so long and so unpronounceable that most people assume that means I'm Greek, and they are correct. So they asked me, since you're someone in Bitcoin who is prominent and has a very weird Greek name, what can you tell us about Bitcoin and the Greek crisis? Can Bitcoin save Greece? Is Bitcoin ready for Greece? Is Greece ready for Bitcoin? And while I would like to answer that question with absolute commitment and optimism, I would like to say that Bitcoin will save Greece. Bitcoin will free the Greeks and also fuck the Troika and the euro. The truth is that while that would be satisfying to say, and it would not be true, Bitcoin cannot save Greece. Bitcoin will not replace the euro. Bitcoin cannot be used by most Greeks for day-to-day business any more than it can be used by most Americans or most Kenyans or most Israelis for day-to-day use. This is the difference between vision and implementation. If you asked me in 1992 whether the internet would one day allow the truth to be told and would threaten dictators and tyrants around the world by making every citizen a journalist and giving people the freedom to speak their mind, I could tell you in 1992 that this was going to happen. But it took 20 years before it actually happened. When we started seeing the internet being used as a tool of freedom against despots and dictators and tyrants in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and in other places around the world, where we saw this happen. And that's the difference between vision and implementation. Bitcoin contains within it the possibility of giving people the power to control their own money. Bitcoin has no bailouts, no bail-ins, no bank holidays, no currency controls, no controls over payment networks. And so if you live in a country, and I have visited several countries that have been in similar circumstances to Greece, because this is not a Greek phenomenon, this is a global economic crisis. I have been to countries where they have had currency controls and bank bailouts and bank bail-ins and radical economics and radical austerity and the inability to make international payments. And I can tell you that some people in these countries can use Bitcoin today to solve these problems, but not everyone, not even a small majority, but really at the moment a tiny, tiny minority. because Bitcoin is not ready. It is still difficult to use. It is difficult to get. It requires a lot of technical expertise. And it is also quite a risky experiment because it has significant volatility, very small liquidity, and is still in the stage where bugs and security problems can cause people to lose their money. Perhaps you remember a time when Yahoo was the king of the internet and hackers could use denial of service attacks to take Yahoo down for days. And people looked at that and said, this is not the basis for an international communications network, and we cannot run telephone networks over this unstable mess. 15 to 20 years later, every telephone call made in the world, almost, is made over the internet. Even the ones that use traditional telephones are very quickly turned into digital connections and transmitted over TCP/IP. And one day, the highly volatile currency that has very little liquidity may actually end up being one of the world's most stable currencies. But we are a long way from that. Greece isn't ready to use Bitcoin from my experience, primarily because there isn't today the infrastructure to implement Bitcoin. I first visited and spoke about Bitcoin in Greece in 2013, where I spoke both at a large conference as well as at a local meeting of the Athens hackerspace. And maybe 15 people showed up at the hackerspace, and there were a few hundred people at the Disrupt conference. But still, Bitcoin was completely unknown. There were very few people in Greece who yet had heard of Bitcoin. That situation has now changed. Necessity is the mother of invention. And crisis is the birth of awareness. So people now are aware because people need to be aware, because the idea of financial security in the euro, of financial security because your bank deposits are guaranteed, that is a joke for most Greeks today. I think what we're seeing is the idea that anyone who understands how Bitcoin works and what the potential is within Bitcoin, the network and the currency, understands that 10 to 20 years from now, a crisis like Greece's liquidity, banking, financial, and monetary crisis with the euro simply could not happen. And the reason it could not happen is if you have widespread adoption of Bitcoin and the availability of Bitcoin as an alternative, then the moment the banks close, no one notices and no one cares because they have a system that never closes. And when they try to take your money, Bitcoin users are not affected because they can't take your money. And when they try to bail in depositors in order to bail out investors, well, they can't bail in your Bitcoin, so the investors are going to have to fail. What this monetary crisis has demonstrated is that in a world where currencies express a monopoly of power, a monopoly that is controlled by an unelected board hundreds of miles away from the people that it affects, and that currency has the entire population as a hostage, then hostage situations can arise. Then democratic governments can be blackmailed into ignoring the will of the people and presenting solutions of an unaccountable and unelected remote elite. Bitcoin is an option that allows the population to say no and to have an alternative that is not financial destruction or financial exclusion, but an alternative that exists as an international community of the internet-connected youth devising their own system of money that is free of banks and free of governments. Bitcoin can't save Greece this time, but in 20 years, Greece and the crisis in Greece cannot happen if we make Bitcoin easier to use, if we make Bitcoin easier to secure, and if we make Bitcoin a currency that most people can use day to day to interact with their community of online friends and partners and businesses all around the world instantaneously and without censorship. Then 20 years from now, this crisis cannot happen again. And that's why Bitcoin matters. There is also an enormous population around the world that simply has no banking facilities at all. People who work and live in cash-based and barter-based societies with no access to credit or international finance or liquidity or investment, no access to do business across borders or in multiple currencies. And Bitcoin also represents an enormous promise of bringing between 4 and 6 billion people into a global international economy that works on the internet. And so these are the reasons why I find Bitcoin intriguing and fascinating, and why I have dedicated my career and spend all of my time working in this space. If you are new to this space, you will find in Bitcoin a technology that is fascinating, that is extremely disruptive, that forces change on one of the oldest technologies that humanity has, money, and transforms that technology in a way that money has not been transformed perhaps more than 3 times in hundreds of thousands of years. And this is the dawn of a new form of money. Participating in Bitcoin, you have the opportunity to be on the front row, in the front seat, during the making of history. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this today, and I would love to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you. All right, let's take some questions. English or Greek? Just raise your hand.
Yes, I am. Can I ask you, how did Bitcoin gain the trust of the people when they first started?
Andreas, the question is, how does Bitcoin...
I'm going to ask you please to...
Okay, can you hear me, Andreas? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the question is how...
There's a slight delay, but yes.
Okay, how does Bitcoin gain the trust of the people when it starts?
When it starts?
Yes, when it first started. When it first entered the market, how did it gain the trust of people?
Very, very slowly. Like any form of money, when people are first presented with a new form of money, they treat it with extreme skepticism, and that is a healthy response. Because as with any form of money that is new, it represents fundamental changes in the way we anticipate and understand money. There was a time when if you were presented with a colored piece of paper and told that this was money, most merchants and most people would laugh because they knew quite well that the only form of money and paper money was a ridiculous idea that would never work. Turns out, paper money did work, and now we're taking one more step and creating abstract digital money. And after 6 years, what we can say about Bitcoin is it works. It works very well. And it continues to survive despite hundreds and hundreds of people predicting that it will soon end. But somehow Bitcoin survives and continues to grow. People trust Bitcoin. At first, they look for a source of trust. Because in every traditional form of money, when you trust a payments network, or when you trust a debit card or credit card, or when you trust a form of money, you have to ask yourself 2 questions. 1, who created it? And 2, who controls it? And those are the fundamental questions of trust. In order to trust the euro, you have to know who creates it and who controls it. And then you have to trust that group of people with your money. The thing about Bitcoin, and the reason most people find it difficult at first, is because they ask who created it and who controls it. And the answer is, it doesn't matter, and no one controls it. And that's a very difficult concept to accept. The idea that just like the internet is not controlled by anyone, Bitcoin is not controlled by any one group of people or one person. It is controlled by all of us. And so trusting in Bitcoin is difficult because it requires understanding a new form of trust, where you're putting trust in the mathematics and equations of how Bitcoin works. And that is a very different form of money than we've ever had before. So at first people did not trust Bitcoin, and at first people did not really give Bitcoin much value. In fact, on the day that Bitcoin's value reached parity with the dollar, so that one Bitcoin was $1, that was a huge moment in Bitcoin. Today we're talking about almost 300 times higher value, but the real threshold was when people were able to put a price on Bitcoin that was relatively stable and that allowed them to see Bitcoin as a suitable means of exchange, as a way to buy products and services. And so from that moment on, it's merely a matter of time. The more people who adopt Bitcoin, the more economic activity there is on Bitcoin, the stronger Bitcoin gets, the more people trust Bitcoin. But fortunately, Bitcoin does not exist without context. It does not exist in a vacuum. Bitcoin exists in a world where the greatest currency crisis of the century is happening right before our very eyes, where more than 24 of the world's currencies are entering hyperinflation crisis, and where the level of debt in economies throughout the world has reached completely unsustainable levels. So it's not just a matter of trusting in Bitcoin, it's also having your trust in traditional currencies and central banking violated grossly every day. And that also helps.
Spiros.
Hi, thank you. Can you describe the mechanics how to reach the liquidity issue going to be resolved in the big term? I mean, given the inflationary nature of the currency, how do you think that
Έλα λίγο πιο κοντά. I'm not going to be able to repeat that. Come a little closer. He's coming a little closer. So Spiros had a question about liquidity issues.
Okay, thank you, because it's echoing.
And how do you envision the mechanics are going to be going to resolve this issue, given the deflationary nature of this currency and the apparent, let's say, instinct of the people to hoard it in the beginning, you know? So I'm not the biggest expert in Bitcoin, but I realize that there are a few people that control a big chunk of it and have already produced more than half of it. So there are about, I don't know, 10 million bitcoins to be harvested until we reach the plateau. So how this hoarded Bitcoin is going to get into circulation, and what will be the motive of the people so that this liquidity issue is going to be resolved?
That's a great question. So it's interesting because hoarding of currency is a uniquely Western phenomenon. And when you talk to people from other parts of the world, they may have a slightly different perspective. So what we call hoarding in the Western world, in China and in Japan and in Korea and in India, they call saving. I don't know if you've heard of that. Saving is when you put money aside for the future. Now, Western people don't do that. We have another system called borrowing instead of saving. And if you live in a society where consumption and borrowing are encouraged, then saving has to have a bad name, so you call it hoarding instead. If you're the average Chinese person, for example, saves about 1/3, 30% of their monthly salary. And that is unthinkable in Western societies that save less than 2% of their monthly income, if that. Now, would you call that hoarding? Because it's using the Chinese yuan? Perhaps not. You might recognize it as saving. I think Bitcoin encourages saving, and it also encourages very smart investment because the money itself is not being destroyed by inflation. And if you live in a society where money is being destroyed by inflation, then you want to take that money and you want to park it in an asset that has longer horizon, like real estate. We saw how well that went in Spain, Italy, and Greece. Or you park it in precious metals, or you buy cars with it, because your anticipation is that this money will be worthless in the near future. So hoarding is really the opposite of that, the expectation that money will be worth more, and theoretically, if you have an instinct to hoard, that means that you will not part with your money unless you can find a superior investment, or because you need to buy something. I think a lot of people who have Bitcoin, myself included, I've been buying Bitcoin or earning Bitcoin since 2012. And I can tell you I've been saving more than I used to, a lot more than I used to, because I am investing in my future and using Bitcoin as an investment vehicle. That may not be the best strategy for everyone. But I'll tell you something else. I've also spent the vast majority of Bitcoin I've ever bought or earned. And the truth is that if you live in the Bitcoin economy, if you buy and earn Bitcoin for a living, you also want to pay bills, and you want to pay your rent and your electricity, and when you travel you want to pay for your plane tickets and your hotels and food. And for all of these things, I either have to use Bitcoin to buy these services or products, or I have to sell Bitcoin. So even though I've been buying all the time, I've also been selling all the time or using all of the time. Very little of my Bitcoin actually gets hoarded, to use that term. I'm not concerned about liquidity for two reasons. One, Bitcoin is divisible to 100 million subunits, which allows people to use smaller and smaller units of Bitcoin while the adoption increases. And secondly, I think a lot of the early adopters of Bitcoin who got a lot of Bitcoin have actually ended up investing that Bitcoin into Bitcoin companies and spending that Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has quite high velocity. Velocity meaning the money that flows from one person to another, making the same unit of currency work again and again and again in multiple transactions. So I'm not particularly concerned about hoarding. I'm also not particularly concerned about the issue of the initial economic inequality. Economic inequality is a factor in every currency. There is no currency that doesn't express economic inequality. The only difference is that the people who own euros today are the people who 3 generations back raped, pillaged, and killed their way through some village or town, stole the wealth were brutal tyrants, kings, and aristocracy. And that's where the inequality comes from. Most of it is historical. Arguably, the people who have a lot of Bitcoin were the people who took enormous risk at a very early stage in a very important technology and invested in that technology. So if we have a future where some of those people end up getting rich, I think they kind of deserve it. I won't be one of them. I do this for free, so I'm not making money on Bitcoin really, but there will be some people in Bitcoin who will become very, very rich. And I think they will become rich because they made the right choices at the right point in history, or they may lose everything and become very, very poor. And certainly when they lose everything because Bitcoin failed, no government is going to bail them out. No government is going to come to their rescue and subsidize the rest of their life. So they're taking enormous risks through this process. So I'm not really worried about hoarding or inequality. Hoarding is an instinct that is easily overcome by the right amount of discount and the right need to spend money to live.
My question is, in your opinion, at the moment, why or how the Bitcoin can help new business for them strategy market?
So the question is how, in your opinion, Bitcoin can help new businesses?
Well, it can help in many ways. It depends on the context, and it depends on what the business does. There's a minor marketing advantage if you are a business that accepts Bitcoin. You'll probably get some customers who have Bitcoin who would otherwise go to another business but come to your business specifically because of the novelty and wow factor of the fact that you can do a transaction in Bitcoin, and it's kind of cool, but that doesn't last. Not many businesses are going to be able to get the marketing boost of being the first to accept Bitcoin. I think more importantly, certain types of businesses benefit tremendously from Bitcoin. Import-export businesses, businesses that depend on importing primary goods in order to convert them or to build additional products or services, and businesses that have international customers or that have staff from many different countries around the world or work with contractors. If you're using an Indian subcontractor to build your website, it's a lot easier to pay them in Bitcoin than it is to pay them in traditional terms. Generally speaking, right now for business, if you do a lot of transactions that involve wire transfers across international borders, then Bitcoin can significantly reduce your cost, increase your flexibility and speed of transaction, and it will also put your money in a position where it cannot be seized, confiscated, frozen, bailed in, or bank holiday.
Panayoti.
Hi. We are already seeing some services getting a prominent place in the Bitcoin ecosystem, like Coinbase, for example. And
So we're already seeing some businesses getting. Do you want to come closer and do it again? I think Panayiotis will come to the microphone.
No, I can hear Panayiotis.
Okay, he's right next to us. Okay, let me ask whoever's got questions, come up here and we can do it quicker.
And to me, this looks like the beginning of what could be called a banking sector for Bitcoin. Like, I mean, we already have vaults and transaction fees. Okay, I know that transaction fees are part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, but I think that we will see more and more fees and more services and value-added services, financial services based on Bitcoin. So what will the banking system of Bitcoin look like, the financial sector in general? And what makes you think that this won't be regulated? Because, okay, Bitcoin cannot be regulated, paper money can't be regulated. It can, but it can't be regulated easily, the money I have in my pocket. And if I had gold, it couldn't be regulated. So what makes you think that if we have a couple of prominent, big Bitcoin services that are where most people put their Bitcoins for safekeeping, for to use extra services, what makes you think that these won't be able to be regulated?
So that's a great question, Panagiotis. So there's two aspects to this. The first one is, what is the future of Bitcoin in terms of centralization versus decentralization? Obviously, at this point, services like Coinbase and other services that are centralized are mostly found at the edge of Bitcoin, where it touches traditional paper currencies and the traditional banking system. And the reason for that is that to interface with the traditional banking system requires a level of centralization at first. And nevertheless, centralization is always more efficient than decentralization. You know, if you want complete control and complete efficiency, fascism is awesome. Centralization is awesome. If you actually want freedom, though, what you do is you use a slightly less efficient system that gives you freedom. And so the question is, do we think that Bitcoin will become ultimately as centralized as existing banking? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is three major effects. The first major effect is that we see centralization at the edge of Bitcoin where it touches national currencies. And that is a predictable outcome when the vast majority of wealth and services are offered in traditional currencies, and Bitcoin's role is as a conversion, where really the economic activity that accrues in Bitcoin is primarily economic activity converted from traditional currencies into Bitcoin. That doesn't last. And the reason that doesn't last is because the most interesting economic activity is the economic activity that is not happening today on traditional currencies, because it cannot happen on traditional currencies because of demographics, geographics, and geopolitics. And that form of economic activity, which, if you look at the statistics, represents approximately half of world GDP, what we call gray markets and barter markets and cash-only markets. Economic activity for the unbanked and underbanked, the 4 billion people who have very little access to these facilities, the 6 billion people who have no access to international currencies, they're not looking to convert money from traditional currencies into Bitcoin because they don't have access to traditional banking. They're not looking to connect to traditional banking. The really interesting economic activity in Bitcoin starts when you start seeing things that couldn't be done in traditional currencies that can only be done in Bitcoin, where Bitcoin starts generating its own economic activity rather than converting economic activity. This is similar to how we thought about the internet in 1992, and we thought about how many phone calls will eventually happen over the internet, and how many fax machines will be replaced by the internet. And that's not where the economic activity came. It did not come by replacing traditional telecommunication with more efficient telecommunication. It came from creating forms of communication and socialization and interaction that never existed before. Most of the economic activity on the internet had no parallel in the traditional world. And most of the economic activity on the future of Bitcoin will not be replacing retail shopping from dollars and euros. It is a whole new world, a whole new global economy that we're building, and that economy is bigger than, and more important than, the rest of the traditional economy. If you believe that 6 billion people have economic productivity potential, and when you connect them, amazing things happen. The second issue you have to realize is that Coinbase and centralized services like that do not scale and cannot scale. This is the traditional problem with finance. The overhead of trying to build control structures, like identifying your customers and anti-money laundering protections, and submitting to the regulation and judicial system of each country you do business in, means that you cannot scale beyond a single country. Maybe you can get 2, maybe you can get 3, There's 194 countries out there. There is no possibility of creating a centralized service that serves 194 different countries. You cannot create the mega infrastructure of the internet. Even Google is not the #1 search engine in China, and Coinbase is not going to be the #1 exchange in the world. What we're going to see instead is 1,000 exchanges, 5 or 6 per country, that are going to do this on a regional basis because the traditional system cannot scale. And the third and most important reason is the issue of innovation. By closing and controlling these systems, centralized financial services turn off the innovation. They become the CompuServe and AOL of Bitcoin. They become the closed ecosystem that cannot do the new applications and all of the new applications that are far more interesting, where all of the economic activity is bound to come, are outside of the scope of centralized systems. We will see a lot of banks try to create replicas of Bitcoin and closed systems that use Bitcoin, but do not use the most disruptive features of Bitcoin. And they will not be able to innovate as fast. They will not be able to solve the issues of economic inclusion that are worldwide issues, and they will not be able to scale. So I'm not concerned about centralization. Financial services that build their systems on Bitcoin represents a foreign team coming and playing in our stadium. And I'm very happy with that environment.
Can I follow up? Just
Please.
a small question. So, in 20 years, I sell my big hit startup for 3 million Bitcoin. Where do I store this?
You store this in your own portable device. Probably your mobile phone that by that point, I mean, we're already seeing it, has hardware, hardened storage on it, secure storage facilities built within your mobile phone with backup capabilities that allow you to securely store Bitcoin on your local device. That's where you store it. You shouldn't be storing Bitcoin on centralized institutions anyway, because the possibility of failure, bail-ins, bailouts, freezes, and seizures is high. I don't store any money on a centralized service at all. I use Coinbase every single week almost, and I'll move Bitcoin to Coinbase, sell it, and then zero my balance. As I've said many, many times, we have an expression here which is possession is 9/10 of the law, meaning that if you have possession of something, you already have 9/10 of the legal claim to it. Well, in Bitcoin, possession is 10/10 of the law. If you possess it, it's yours, and if you don't possess it, it's not really yours. If you control the keys, it's your Bitcoin. So the answer is really simple. If you want to really take advantage of Bitcoin, the network platform, you must retain control of your keys. You must use the decentralization features to have financial independence. Otherwise, it's not Bitcoin, it's banking. And banking fails, as we've seen many times.
Okay, thanks.
Patricia.
Hi, Andrea. It's me again. I would like to follow up on a question.
Hello.
I would like to follow up on the question from Spiros, who rightly mentioned deflationary tendencies in Bitcoin. I would like to assess a little bit better these deflationary tendencies. So, I think a piece of information that you may or may not have. Would you know what is the attrition rate of Bitcoin at this point in the world? Because obviously a set number of coins have been created. Some of them may have been lost forever or hoarded and lost forever. If you have this piece of information, I would be great.
There's varying estimates on the attrition rate. I think at the moment, probably about 10% of the Bitcoin at the lower end we can consider have already been lost. It may be as high as 25%. However, keep in mind that this is based on an exponentially decreasing issuance. There is also an exponentially decreasing attrition rate. A lot of Bitcoin was lost in the early days when it had no value, and people were not protecting it. Over time, the amount of Bitcoin that is getting lost is decreasing at an exponential rate, just as the issuance is. And the important thing to remember is that Bitcoin can be subdivided by more than 8 decimal points if necessary. It is a relatively straightforward adjustment to create units that are smaller than Satoshis and adjust the Bitcoin protocol to handle another 8 decimal points below, which would then allow for certainly the practical use as a means of exchange without having to use really, really tiny units that are deflated into enormous value.
How does the mining rate compare to the attrition rate, let's say, for 2014?
Oh, the mining rate is far exceeds the attrition rate at this point. Still, but you know, I mean, we're mining at a rate of 25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. Yeah, that's about 3,600 Bitcoin a day. And we're not losing that much Bitcoin at that rate. I would say probably mining at twice the rate. At the moment, Bitcoin is still inflationary. It hasn't, I mean, at some point the curve crosses and it becomes a deflationary currency, but today, because the adoption is still low and the mining rate is still high, Bitcoin is actually inflating. The issuance of the currency is quite high.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering how much other electronic currencies affect Bitcoin. That's pretty much it.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah. How much other electronic currencies affect Bitcoin?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think for the most part, Bitcoin affects the other digital currencies far more than the other digital currencies affect Bitcoin. And the reason for that is because in order to buy any one of the digital currencies, usually you start with Bitcoin. There are very few places where you can directly buy another digital currency using a traditional national currency. Usually you would convert your money to Bitcoin first and then use Bitcoin to buy the other currencies, which means that in a strange way, most of the alternative currencies use Bitcoin indirectly as a reserve currency or store of value, a back-end currency. And they tightly follow the exchange rates of Bitcoin. So when Bitcoin goes up, the alt currencies go up. When Bitcoin goes down, the alt currencies go down. They have some independent movement, of course. But they are very strongly influenced by the movement of Bitcoin. On the broader scheme, I think what happens is the alternative currencies really are a robust ecosystem that offers an evolutionary view of digital currencies, where if you think of each of these digital currencies as a species, they find the environmental niche that allows them to thrive or not, and they fail. And in this evolutionary environment, all of these species are competing either for the same ecology and turf or for different ecologies that are very specific. In that adaptive evolution, these currencies invent new things. And what we know from evolution, especially this kind of evolution where you have developers who are able to compare these currencies. What that means is that inventions that happen in alternative currencies can be assimilated and absorbed into Bitcoin. So if a currency develops a new thing that doesn't exist in Bitcoin, it is actually more likely that Bitcoin can absorb that new feature and use its dominant marketing and adoption and higher levels of security to compete, rather than finding such a compelling feature that appeals to a broad enough demographic that you would see an alternative currency become bigger than Bitcoin.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It's a two-part question. The first part of the question is a historic one. What, in your opinion, or in reality happened in 2014 for the Bitcoin to gain so much popularity and its price go so up? 2 years ago, the price of the Bitcoin was something about $10 or $15. In 2014, it went almost reached $1,000, and then it stabilized around $300. What really happened back then? That's the first part of the question.
Okay, so the answer, well, first I want to point out that the rise from about $260 to about $1,100 was not the highest volatility moment for Bitcoin. Bitcoin actually rose more as a percentage and then fell more as a percentage when it went up to $1. And it also rose and fell more as a percentage when it went up to $30 and then collapsed to 75 cents. So if you look at it in perspective and you just ignore the absolute number, this was Bitcoin's third most volatile event. And what we see over time is that the volatility is decreasing. Now, as to what happened, the answer is really simple. China happened. And China happened on a very, very small scale. A couple of exchanges opened in China. They managed to recruit a lot of people who were eager to find places to invest their money. They promoted Bitcoin as a get-rich-quick scheme. And they very, very quickly, with only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the Chinese population, inflated a giant bubble that could not possibly be sustained, and which subsequently crashed back and reverted to mean. The average growth rate, if you ignore the bubble blowing up and then collapsing again, has remained relatively steady, and we're seeing nice steady growth over the last 6 years. You just have to ignore the events that cause more than 2 standard deviations of growth, because those are bubble events. And we never know when something like that can happen. Just in the last 3 months, the Chinese stock market has experienced a massive influx of new but undereducated investors, approximately creating 4 million new stock trading accounts every month. And they bought and then sold the Chinese stock market so that it went up 30% and then collapsed almost 40% in the last month. So it's no different. What's happening to the Chinese stock market, a small-scale, similarly event happened to Bitcoin, and it could happen again. A single documentary on Chinese TV that mentions Bitcoin could drive 1 million people to Bitcoin from China, because China has 1 billion people.
Thank you. The second part of the question is, I know you're a Bitcoin expert, everybody knows that. Do you have any projection or any idea of, or do you believe that there is an altcoin that may have some potential?
I don't really believe that. First of all, I believe that there will be thousands of altcoins and they will coexist with Bitcoin quite comfortably. But I don't think that an altcoin can easily, I think it's in fact very difficult for an altcoin to replace Bitcoin or to rise to the same level, because it's actually very difficult to bootstrap a currency to broad adoption, and Bitcoin already has a massive head start, massive brand recognition around the world. And so even if you see something that is radically different that Bitcoin could affect people adopting Bitcoin, I think in many cases you might see Bitcoin adopting similar changes and then rebranding everything as Bitcoin again. It might be a very different Bitcoin, but the name might already have stuck. So I think we're going to live in a world with many alt currencies, and Bitcoin will always be one of the strong ones, if not the strongest by far.
Like the gold standard, let's say, something like that?
It's an interesting concept, because Bitcoin is the very redefinition of the gold standard as a digital equivalent. But already we're seeing that it may serve as better gold than gold, as a digital gold, and as the first stable, high liquidity, high volume transaction-based system that exists in the world that's independent of governments.
Thank you, Andreas.
Any more questions for Andreas? Anybody? Yes.
Yeah.
Come a little closer. Come a little closer. And then I'll have a question too. But mine will be very, very simple, I think. Let's go on. You have a seat over there, and
Yeah, so my question is, do you ever see an integration of Bitcoin and the banks? Any sort of relationship between Bitcoin and a bank? In any form?
Absolutely. I see it in many, many forms. Listen, I talk to banks all the time, and they are fascinated by the possibility and terrified by the possibility of Bitcoin. And so a lot of banks are trying to use the technology within Bitcoin in order to remove intermediaries that they have. So when banks make transactions with other banks, they use centralized clearinghouses that cost a lot of money, are slow and inefficient. So if they can use Bitcoin's technology to replace these organizations, they very much want to do that. There's a lot of banks that serve very large populations, not the big investment banks, but very large consumer banks, especially in the developing world. Banks in Brazil and Peru and Chile and Argentina and South America and South Africa, in Indonesia, banks where in order to reach populations, you're looking at more than 50% of the population outside of the banking system because they cannot be reached by traditional technology. These banks are very interested in using Bitcoin to extend banking services to these customers. And inevitably, we're going to see some kind of mergers where at the end, Bitcoin becomes the most efficient mechanism for banks to transmit money internationally, and they offer Bitcoin services to their customers. However, the important thing to realize is that banks cannot adopt Bitcoin without dramatically changing their own nature. Bitcoin will not be subject to the same regulations, and it makes many of the traditional banking concepts obsolete. So that in adopting Bitcoin, the banks themselves undergo significant change. Just like, and I think the parallel is really strong. In 1992, I remember quite strongly, like even before that, let's say the late 80s, I don't know if you remember these. How many people were in the late 80s using modems to connect to the internet or connect to bulletin board systems? Anyone in the audience? Am I the oldest person in the room? All right, okay, one person. Thank you. Thank you for agreeing to be as old as me. So when I used a modem in the late 80s, OTE, the telephone company, would shut down modem connections if you were trying to make an international modem call. They would actually run software in their switches that would detect a modem call and disconnect the line. Why? Because they didn't want the competition on long distance. I would guess at the moment probably 60 to 75% of OTE's traffic runs on TCP/IP. In the US, among the telephone companies, it's 100% of the traffic running over TCP/IP. Anything that leaves the local area runs over TCP/IP. Or at least over IP. And the point is that in the end, the phone companies became internet companies. When they tried to play in the internet space, it transformed them so dramatically that they became internet companies. And as a result, they couldn't continue their traditional practices. No more charging you by the minute, no more telling you what equipment you can and can't connect, no more telling you what applications you can and can't run. So, yes, the phone companies became internet companies, but they did so by changing themselves. And the banks, yes, they will play with Bitcoin, but in the end, they will become Bitcoin by changing themselves, because they have no other choice.
So you said that that was late 80s, early 90s, using the example with the mobile companies or the telephone companies and the internet, and you said the banks have to change drastically. What's the time frame for banks to start implementing Bitcoin services?
What's the top what?
What's the time frame for banks to start implementing Bitcoin services?
Well, I think it depends on the region, and it depends on the positioning of different banks. I think what we're going to see most likely in the Western